The Acolyte Season 1, yeah, probably Season 1, has recently finished, and its 8th and final episode aired this past Tuesday. The first live-action Star Wars series set outside the bounds of the Skywalker Saga films, the show started with a whimper. Despite a surprisingly respectful level of marketing, and I found it to be absolutely fascinating in its range of quality. Not for the reasons many have, as lots of folks have been heralding it as the worst thing since Satan and the death of Star Wars, but that can't really be true because the second on-screen Star Wars story ever was the holiday special, and we somehow rebounded from that. But as for The Acolyte, in my opinion, it's just kinda alright. I'll get into that later. This video is going to be a lot less editing heavy than my other ones because I wanted to not spend weeks on it and get it out in a reasonable amount of time. This video is going to be split into some numbered sections, so skip around if you so please. But yeah, The Acolyte, the first Star Wars series set outside the Skywalker Saga, was okay. Let's get into it. The Acolyte takes place 100 years before The Phantom Menace, and centers itself on the Jedi Order pursuing an assassin who's killing Jedi with a mysterious connection to her past. I'm not a recapper unless we're talking books and comics, am I right? But I'm not a recapper, so I'm not gonna just run through the plot. The Acolyte decided to focus on telling a much different story than every other Star Wars series, leaning far into some deeper areas of canon and Legends expanded universe lore. The show also outed a whole lot of grifters as simply using Legends as a talking piece for them to hate canon. But it also felt really firmly grounded in the EU, which I saw as a huge plus. But none of that is actual plot. Those are details, not plot. I found the series' actual plot, the investigation of the Jedi murders, followed up by the pursuit of Sol and the twins switching places, as very lacking. The show moved at a pace that didn't really allow for a ton of fleshing out of the characters involved. I, however, found the idea of a Sith emerging from the shadows during a time when they're supposed to be extinct very interesting, and was happy it was explored in a good way. The Jedi covering it up all feels right, especially if you've read The High Republic, and I'm intrigued by how that reflects on the Jedi as presented in the prequels. A lot of the plot of the show seemed to be controversial, as the Jedi were portrayed as less than perfect, but I really didn't have an issue with that at all, though I'll touch on that in my next point. But as for plot, I think the most interesting developments to me were the events of that night on Brandok. Of course, the series focuses on it so much. And my favorite episode of the series was episode 7, where we see those events from the Jedi point of view, adding on to the girl's point of view we saw in episode 3. This all worked really well for me, and I like that kind of storytelling, given how I like The Last Jedi. And it worked much better than episode 6, which was my least favorite and felt meandering and unknowing of where it wanted to go in a dynamic sense. The plot structure of this series is confounding to me, as lots of interesting things happen, and I do care about the characters, but those instances of me caring are absolutely not equally divided amongst the season. Now to the Jedi. A huge controversies in modern Star Wars discourse are so tiring because of people that wrap them up in the culture war. No, just because the Acolyte portrays the Jedi Order in a less than positive light does not mean Western civilization is under threat. You can calm down. The Jedi Order's portrayal in this series was what I was most curious about going in. I knew the Sith wouldn't be a public thing, so I wasn't really worried about that changing the lore. They wouldn't do that. I was more worried about what it would take for the Jedi to go into that situation and why, and how they'd come out the other side. In that regard, I really liked the Jedi Order's portrayal in the series. Yord and Jeki represent some growing archetypes within the Order that we see in the prequels in a good way, though I wish we had some more time with them. But the biggest part of the Jedi's portrayal is the Brendok Four again: Indara, Kelnaka, Torben, and Sol. These Jedi find themselves in a very confusing situation. They're presented with a coven of witches that seems to be using the dark side around divergence in the Force. This alarms them and causes them all to act a little rash in many different ways. As people would. The way the Jedi act in the 7th episode of the series really made me happy from a storytelling point of view, not because of what they did. They did some messed up stuff. This show wasn't afraid to present a situation where both sides weren't in the right, and because of that, things collapsed into chaos. two religions not fully understanding each other despite having a lot in common. Lack of communication and some selfish desires between both sides led to a disaster. A misunderstanding that could have been solved by open and honest conversation either before or after the disaster occurred led to the dark side. This portrays the Jedi as not perfect peacekeepers, but humans who struggle to do the right thing in messy situations. These Jedi later become depressed and cope with their trauma in different ways. These Jedi are liars, but that doesn't make the entire order bad. It just shows that maintaining balance in the light side of the Force is difficult. And by the way, this show doesn't contradict that either. Strictly using the light side is balance, and the imbalance is usage of the dark side. The Acolyte might show some morally gray situations for both light and dark side users, but those are complex situations laid out on a spectrum of light and dark where balance is still found only in aligning yourself with the light. The complexity arrives in that not embracing but accepting your dark side, your rash emotions and your mistakes, not repressing them like Soul did, gives one balance. And anything the Sith say about balance being light and darkness and embracing your true self is very clearly just trying to lure light side users to the dark. Now let's get to some real criticisms. I found myself having some serious problems with the Acolyte's editing and shot variety. Editing in particular is such an elegant way to tell a story, and the reconstruction of a story in the editing room is beautiful to me with how that interplays with the script. You can streamline a story where it needs to be, and slow it down where it needs to be slow. Unfortunately, I didn't find the Acolyte particularly strong in these areas in several of its episodes. Probably every single one at points. I firmly believe that significant scenes within a narrative piece of filmmaking should generally adhere to an act structure within themselves, just as the entire piece should adhere to those same tenets. Exposition, rising action, climax, and falling action within each scene, and within each episode. Diversions to this are of course welcome in narrative works, but only with artistic reason to do so, or they kind of don't justify themselves. And I found the Acolyte to be severely lacking in this area, presenting things in a boring and paragraph-like way, except for a few good instances, like the ends of episodes 4 and 8. But particularly, I really disliked how the show decided to end its episodes. So sudden, so little fanfare, so little finality. The pacing of the entire series, actually, was so uneven. The way the story was laid out just didn't really work for me across the series. As I mentioned earlier, the plot developments in The Acolyte were so unevenly distributed, leading to long stretches of boring, confusingly placed sequences that didn't really contribute to the overall narrative or important characters' development in the most streamlined way that they could. Episodes 6 and 4 specifically stink of this issue to me. Episode 4 seemed to focus so much on characters getting from place to place, something that Lucas admittedly did a lot in his prequel films. But in Lucas's films, characters getting from place to place is interesting and unique, and builds the world in a way that the events of Kofar really didn't very well. And episode 6 slowed things down, giving us a borderline dual bottle episode with the twins each being trapped with the other one's master. This could have led to some interesting conflicts, but instead was bogged down in some discussion of ideology that would have fared much better in a different situation. Yes, everything that happened in these 2 weaker episodes was important, but just because it's important doesn't mean this is how it had to happen. There had to be a more interesting way to intercut or even rewrite these scenes to occur on top of interesting plot developments, right? Character development is best in Star Wars when it's paired with physical development or something physical happening. I just didn't really feel that very well in episode 6. Oh yeah, and the lightsaber duels were incredible. Even as not really a big fan of lightsaber duels, the choreography was completely on point, and so was the acting. As this channel isn't just about live-action Star Wars, I'm actually going to talk about the High Republic here. I've read the entire High Republic series up to what is released as of today, and I think the Acolyte's connections to this publishing initiative and events of the era are really great. It means so much to me that the aesthetics and world building of an era established off-screen have been so faithfully translated onto it, and it sets a really good precedent for Star Wars, at least from the point of view of those who enjoy the franchise in a multimedia depth. I am of the opinion that the High Republic contains some of the best Star Wars stories ever told. I'm looking at you, The Rising Storm and Trail of Shadows. And I think The Acolyte is not one of those, clearly, but it does interplay really well with the era overall, and that brought me a lot of joy. Jedi on the Frontier, the Great Disaster, the Robes, the Jedi's role as part of the Republic, other Force religions, the Jedi covering up their wrongs, all of this symbolizing their slide into imbalance. A conflict that could have been solved if everyone just sat down and discussed their problems. All of these are core to the High Republic era in books and comics, and I'm so glad they've been well represented in The Acolyte. Vernestra Rwoh in particular was really well done in The Acolyte, and the funny thing is that I wouldn't have told you that until seeing the finale. Before I'd seen the 8th episode, I would have told you that Vernestra is a cold, name-only character insert whose job is to spout exposition. But episode 8, which was really good overall and brought things together for the whole season, also brought things together for her. Gave her some actually interesting scenes where she lies to support the Jedi Order. Not a good thing at all, but interesting stuff, especially to see from a character who strives so intensely to be good in the books. But we've also seen this kind of cynicism from her a little bit. Overall, The Acolyte was just really okay to me. I loved a lot of the story decisions. May, Sol, Osha, and Kymir are all fascinating vessels for exploring the role of the Jedi and the Force in the galaxy and in people's lives. And the series meant a lot to me as a fan of Star Wars off the screen. There's so much to love in The Acolyte. The production design was great, the cinematography was mostly good, could have used some more shot variety, but was still nice to look at, and the makeup and acting were both great as well. There were so many small characters that were just really delightful in a really core Star Wars way in this show. The series also featured a lot more aliens than we're used to, especially in non-villain roles when compared to other live-action Star Wars shows. But I cannot overlook, as hard as I try, the inefficient and genuinely lackluster execution of this series from a filmmaking point of view. Talk about inconsistent. It's almost like they didn't get creative enough with the editing process, and didn't have it interplay very well with the writing of the series. It's so possible to structure scripts in a way that use editing and pacing to express things that can't be outright expressed narratively, and the show just kind of refuses to do so at several points. This was highlighted by a particularly poignant sequence in the end of episode 8, which gave me what I'd been looking for from the style of this series. And that's really important. The style of this series is specific, and it determines how things work when interacting with other styles present in the Star Wars universe. I get that the storytelling of this show was trying to emulate Lucas's cinematic language as established in his Star Wars films, and I respect that, but it becomes a lot harder to respect if you're not gonna get it right. This show attempts this, and in my opinion, fails, leading to a rather unenjoyable, disjointed, and inconsistent viewing experience of a story that I think has so much heart and strength to it, is grounded in such a tangible love for the wide universe of Star Wars, and has a very firm understanding of its values and themes. This is so confusing. It almost feels to me like if they really wanted to lean into their own style of cinematic storytelling, they could have, and it would have ended up better than this, where they tried to replicate things that just didn't fit the style of this show. And you can tell, whenever the show leans into its own thing and it's not trying so outwardly to be Star Wars with the wipes and the cameos, it actually is really, really good. I can't really ever see myself hating this show, despite how much its lackluster areas stick out to me. It just has too many things that I like about Star Wars in it. And those are important. Star Wars is not just about the storytelling, and communicates things sometimes more thematically than on a good storytelling level. And I think The Acolyte, unfortunately, shines in that area. It has a lot to say, but says it in a really messy way that a little bit gets in the way of understanding that. Also, I don't want to be grouped in with the haters of this show because there are so many people that fully expected this series to be awful, and were so prepared to hate it from the minute it was announced with the creative team behind it. Blatant stupidity and people just wanting the show to be bad, so they look for any reason that they can. I wasn't that person. I was there for the premiere of this show in a movie theater just one day before the opening night. I really wanted it to be amazing, but it's just okay. It had some moments that absolutely stunned me. They were incredible, and the filmmaking on display was very, very good. But it also had moments that confused me and made me ask, what are we doing here? That's not to say I dislike it. It's always going to hold a special place in my heart. But The Acolyte overall is just alright. Oh, also, Plagueis is here, and if you really care about Ki-Adi-Muadi's birthday, you're probably not enjoying Star Wars the way you should be. If you're new here, I do a reading recommendation at the end of every video, and I've got to go with The High Republic Path of Deceit by Tessa Gratton and Justina Ireland for this video. If you were intrigued by the idea of a group of Jedi investigating a Force cult on a remote planet in this show, this is literally the plot of Path of Deceit. You're gonna like it, and it might just be your gateway into the wonderful world of the High Republic.